Welcome, people of planet Earth and all planets beyond. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Josh, and today we're going to talk about 10 rules for vintage clothing that are
more what you call guidelines than actual rules.
Yeah, let's get into it. Now, when we're talking about vintage clothing and we try to identify it or sell it, we need to try to be able to describe it as well as we can, and so we often go to these sort of rules about vintage clothing. Well, some of those rules are not nearly as rule-ish or as absolute as a lot of times people make of them. So we're going to talk about those 10 rules that are really, a little bit less authoritative than maybe we think they are. Now, the first rule we're going to talk about is the single stitch t-shirt rule, that all single stitch t-shirts are older than 1996. Now, this may be a little bit of misnomer, and there is some debate, because while it is generally true that most t-shirts, and perhaps the majority of t-shirts manufactured prior to 1996 were single stitch, and that gives us a good idea, there appears to be at least some debate as to whether or not the production completely ended, and even if it did, single stitch t-shirts that were produced prior to 1996 were still being used, printed on, and sold as brand new t-shirts for the next several years. There are plenty of examples of t-shirts from the early 2000s that are single stitch. They're not double stitch. So that sort of breaks the mold. So you have to remember a little bit that while it's generally true, it's not absolutely true. So you got to stay on your toes and use other methods to confirm the identity of your suspected vintage t-shirt. Now, the next rule is actually sort of the opposite, the inversion of that previous rule, and that's that all double stitch t-shirts are modern t-shirts. While it's generally true that most double stitch t-shirts are going to likely be modern, it's not absolutely true. The 1996 and onwards until, probably 2003 is probably the latest I've ever seen a single stitch t-shirt. There are double stitch t-shirts and single stitch t-shirts being produced at the same time. So a t-shirt in 1997 may have a double stitch, and that makes it vintage, but it is double stitch. So you have to be aware that there is some overlap. Now, to sort of muddy the waters even further, companies like Guess, like this t-shirt right here, which was produced prior to 1993, actually is double stitched itself. So the double stitch did not just emerge after 1996. In fact, I've seen Nike t-shirts from the early 90s and the late 80s with double stitch. It does somewhat depend on that particular maybe product line or that brand, that depending on what they decided to use. There are single stitch Nike and there are double stitch Nike from roughly the same era. Same thing with Guess. Guess has some single stitch t-shirts, but they have a lot of double stitch t-shirts from the same era. So it's not cut and dry that all double stitch t-shirts are modern. Most of them may be modern, but there are some that are not. Now, next up is clothing produced internationally is not vintage. And while it is true that by the early 2000s, most of American textile production had been outsourced to other countries, we have been outsourcing textile production for decades. The 70s and 80s were replete with examples of primarily acrylic-like sweaters, oftentimes being produced in Hong Kong and Korea and Singapore and Macau. So these places actually were producing clothing decades and decades ago and were being imported. Just depended on what was cheaper and who had the right mills for certain things, particularly with newer fabrics like acrylic had become. So it doesn't mean absolutely that if it's foreign made and imported that it's not vintage. You just have to know sort of roughly where it's being imported from and look at the other factors to determine that. Now, the inverse to that rule is that all clothing made in USA is vintage. Again, largely true, but not absolutely true. There are examples in modern day that clothing that's made in the USA still in the last 15 years. Now, what comes to mind particularly is like you'll see there's these t-shirt company called Bayside. Oftentimes they are made in USA. In fact, they may be entirely made in USA, but they have tags. They look kind of like vintage t-shirts, but they're actually still being made in the last 10 years or so in America. So they break the mold. I've often confused them, at least early on in my sort of thrifting vintage career. I've mistaken those for vintage t-shirts. Some of those base sides may actually be vintage, but most of them, or at least a lot of them that I've encountered, are not. Now this next one has to do with Levi's, and we've all heard of the big E, capital E, Levi's tab jeans that we all believe are older than 1971. And again, that's largely true. But there are examples of the big E being added to the tabs of jeans after 1971. And that a lot has to do with the fact that productions, just doesn't turn around immediately. So a pair of jeans that was produced at a certain year and then released later, or there was an excess of tabs that still hadn't been used up, and so they used up those tabs until they were all done. The oldest case I've ever seen of a big E on a pair of jeans or pants after 1971 was like 1976. So it is possible to find big E jeans that were produced after 1971, which was the transitional year. They are rare, and they are, certainly not as common. Now, the problem here, though, is that Levi's now has brought the big E back, and they use the big E on the tabs of their premium line jeans. So probably half of the questions that I get in my inbox are people confused by these modern Levi's jeans that are big E. So yes, the big E, and most big E's you will probably find should be from previous to 1971, but there are those rare examples for the years afterwards, and there are definitely modern examples. That's why it's really important not just to rely on one single factor when trying to determine the age or identity of a particular garment. Now the next rule has to do with Levi's as well, but it's a bit more broad, and that has to do with salvage. That salvage denim is always vintage. Now this may have been far more true 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, but the salvage denim revolution has really kicked off, and there are dozens, if not, over 100 companies making salvage denim. Ralph Lauren has salvage denim. Levi's is doing salvage denim. There are all kinds of amazing Japanese salvage denim products. So it's not true anymore that, if it's salvage, it's vintage. That's certainly not the case. I've probably found as many modern salvage denim jeans as I've found vintage salvage denim jeans in thrift stores. So it's a lot harder to use this rule anymore. You really have to rely on other factors rather than just whether or not it's salvage or not. Now the next rule that's more like a guideline is that the older an item is, the more valuable it is, which really isn't the case. It may be generally the case, but it's certainly not specifically the case. And the case in point I would use is like Nirvana band t-shirts are far more valuable than even Van Halen and Led Zeppelin t-shirts from the early 80s and the late 70s. These t-shirts from that era, which are fairly rare, still don't command anywhere near the price of 90s grunge t-shirts do today. And that has a lot to do with the desirability, the trendiness, and the rarity. There may be a lot more of, let's say, Journey t-shirts from the 80s than there are of Nirvana heart-shaped box tees. And because of that, the heart-shaped box tee is automatically going to be a bit more valuable simply because it's rare, not because it's older. When we talk about something being more valuable because it's older, it's generally because it's rarer, because the longer it's been around, the more the different items have been destroyed and lost to time, and the fewer and fewer may be in existence. Well, that really is what determines the price ultimately of the value of any sort of vintage garment. So just because it's older does not necessarily mean it's going to be more valuable. Now, the next rule that's more like a guideline is that the copyright date on a graphic on a t-shirt indicates the production date. This is not true. It may be generally true, but it's not specifically true all the time. In fact, I had a Batman t-shirt that had a copyright date of 1966. t-shirt was definitely not produced in 1966, but the graphic they used was copyrighted in 1966. So generally you can use this copyright date to get pretty close, or approximately, to the year that it was produced. And you might see that same art used later on, and the copyright have been updated. So maybe an art that was used in 1995 gets reused in 2018 and gets a new copyright date of 2018. Or maybe they still use the copyright of 1995. In that case, you have to be aware that that t-shirt may not be from 1995. It may be from 2018. You just have to look at other markers. So these all in combination can be helpful. If you use them in isolation, you might get hosed. Now, the ninth guideline we're going to look at is that textile production standards change universally all at the same time within a given company. And this is absolutely not the case. There are obviously many exceptions to this rule. In fact, exceptions almost might be the rule. Like with the Big E transition in 1971, some factories still used up their Big E tabs until they were completely gone into the mid 70s. And the same for the Levi's 3-digit factory code. You might find, some exceptions, that some jeans that were produced in 1983 or 82 that don't adhere to the 3-digit factory code. And there are these type of exceptions all over the place. In fact, there are very few rules that are very absolute that I've ever found. And, maybe I'll do a video about the rules that are absolute, but there are very few that I have ever found in my entire life that are perfectly absolute. Exceptions sometimes really are the rule. Now, they may not be the rule for decades later, because obviously the transition should have already happened. But these are large mass production companies that, it takes a long time to turn that ship. So there certainly will be exceptions to every one of these little rules. Now, the 10th and final rule that's more like a guideline is that if the internet said it, it must be true. And of course, we know that that phrase is completely false in this day and age. But it's important to realize that guys like me and, the forums you might find and the websites and blogs you might read, most of that information is all first-hand or second-hand knowledge. It's our anecdotes, it's our experience, it's our observations, it's our own testing and trying of certain rules and methods to determine the age of a particular garment. So just because the internet said it, or you found somebody on the internet who said it, doesn't mean it's true. It definitely doesn't mean it's absolutely true. And that goes for me as well. The things that I say and give you guys here on this channel, I have done as much diligence as I can to, confirm that these rules, so to speak, are accurate and reliable. But there may be exceptions, and because it's based on my research, the research of others, and our personal experience, it definitely can still be false, or at least not fully true. Because there are no official guides from these big companies, they didn't think that we would be as interested in their clothes 40 years later. So they didn't keep all of these records perfectly. They didn't have the same regulations. They didn't keep inventory as tight and controlled as they do now. Like, that stuff wasn't as documented. It wasn't easy. We have the internet now. Like, we have computers. We can document all this stuff so much easier today, far easier than we could back then. So they simply just didn't do it. And so there's a lack of information. There's a knowledge gap. And in fact, you could probably ask some of these companies, and I know it has happened with Levi's. Levi's has actually had to ask, denim collectors for information and observation because there aren't official records of certain things. So just remember that all this information is great, but it also, you have to sort of weigh it with your own experience and, maybe the word of others, and hope you can get pretty close to the approximate date if that's what you're going for. Anyways, I thank you guys so much for watching. Hope this was a little bit helpful. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.